There's a story that most of us were born into. We didn't choose it. We inherited it, like a family heirloom wrapped in fear and reverence. It tells us who we are, why we suffer, and who's watching. It gives us meaning, but only if we obey. And for centuries, that story has ruled our lives without question. But what if the story itself was the cage? What if the thing that gave you comfort was also the thing that kept you from seeing? Because once you understand where religion really came from, you'll never look at it the same way again. The story that owned us. Every culture has told the same kind of story. A world born from chaos. A higher being shaping us from dust. Rules written in stone. Punishment for doubt. It sounds ancient, timeless, sacred. But beneath the poetry, there's something simpler. Control. A god creates. A prophet speaks. A book appears. And from that book comes order, not just spiritual, but political. Long before science, government, or philosophy, religion was humanity's first operating system. It told us what to eat, who to marry, what to fear, what to hope for. It filled the silence that nature refused to explain. But every story came with a catch: obedience. If you followed the rules, you were blessed. If you questioned them, you were cursed. Morality became less about compassion and more about compliance. That's the brilliance and the danger of religion. It never needed evidence. It only needed repetition. Because the more a story is repeated, the more it starts to feel like truth. Over time, myth hardened into identity. Ritual became law. Authority disguised itself as holiness. It wasn't born out of evil, it was born out of fear. Tribes needed unity to survive. Leaders needed loyalty to rule, and the easiest way to control behavior was to link it to eternity. Believe, and you'll be rewarded. Doubt, and you'll burn forever. That bargain built civilizations. Temples became governments. Faith became currency. Questioning became treason. The story was powerful enough to unite millions, but also dangerous enough to blind them. Religion didn't just tell us who created the world. It decided who gets to own it, who gets to speak for it, and who must never question it. And somewhere along the way, we forgot that the story was written by human hands and started living as if it had written us. The fear that built faith. At the root of every belief lies one emotion: fear. Fear of death, fear of chaos, fear of being small in a universe that doesn't care if we live or die. Long before people understood disease, weather, or time itself, fear filled every silence. Thunder wasn't just sound, it was anger. Death wasn't just nature, it was punishment. Religion offered a story to silence that fear. You are chosen, you are watched, you are loved if you follow the rules. It was comforting because it gave meaning to the meaningless. It turned randomness into destiny. But it was also terrifying, because the same voice that said, "You are loved," also whispered, "or else." Heaven and hell were never about moral balance. They were about leverage. The promise of eternal paradise and the threat of eternal pain created the perfect psychological cage. Once you feared forever, you became manageable. You didn't just obey God, you obeyed the people who claimed to speak for Him. Think about it. Fear made you moral, but only under surveillance. Every thought, every impulse, suddenly mattered. A divine judge watched not only what you did, but what you wanted to do. Guilt became constant background noise, the emotional tax of belonging, and fear disguised itself as faith. It's easy to see why it worked. Fear unites faster than love ever could. It keeps communities disciplined, leaders powerful, and questions buried. For thousands of years, the fear of divine punishment did what no army could. It made people police themselves. And that's the quiet genius of religion's design. You don't need chains when people fear the consequences of freedom. Because once fear became sacred, obedience didn't feel forced anymore, it felt holy. The inheritance of guilt. We're taught that guilt is proof of morality, that it shows conscience, compassion, and inner goodness. But what if guilt wasn't born from virtue at all? What if it was engineered? From the moment you enter most faiths, you inherit a debt you never agreed to. It's called original sin. The idea that you were born flawed, tainted, unworthy of love until you earn it through obedience. Before you can even speak, the story tells you, something in you is wrong. Then come the rituals designed to manage that guilt: confession, repentance, penance. The promise is forgiveness, but only if you go through the proper gatekeepers. It's a cycle that never ends, because the cure depends on the disease staying alive. If you're told you're broken, you'll keep returning for repair. If salvation is the only medicine, the church becomes your pharmacy, and your illness becomes profitable. That's not morality. That's emotional debt collection disguised as holiness. This is how religion turned inner conscience into external control. True morality doesn't need an audience. It comes from empathy, not authority. But when guilt is institutionalized, people stop trusting their own sense of right and wrong. They start outsourcing it. And the guilt doesn't fade with time. It becomes generational. Parents pass it to children. Shame becomes a family heirloom. You don't just inherit a belief system. You inherit the constant feeling that you can never be enough. And that's the genius of it, a self-renewing system of control where even your private thoughts can condemn you. Because if people can be convinced that virtue requires suffering, they'll never stop punishing themselves. And the system that taught them to feel broken will always have a reason to exist. The walls around the mind. Think about this. Every child learns their religion before they learn how to think, before logic, before skepticism, before they even have the tools to question what's being poured into their mind. That's not education. That's programming. The first stories they hear aren't about exploration or doubt. They're about obedience, punishment, and eternal consequences. A child doesn't understand metaphors. They take everything literally. So when they're told that God is always watching, every thought, every impulse, it plants a seed of fear that grows into identity. We punish curiosity and call it faith. We glorify obedience and call it virtue. We tell children that doubt is dangerous, that questions offend the divine. But here's the truth. If a belief can't survive a question, it was never strong enough to begin with. Religion learned early that the easiest way to protect itself is to start before reason does. Capture the imagination, and you capture the person. Once faith is embedded in childhood, it feels like fact, not choice. By the time critical thinking arrives, it's already fenced in by fear. And so the mind builds invisible walls, not out of evidence, but emotion. Every time doubt appears, guilt slams the door shut. Every time logic knocks, fear answers instead. It's a perfectly designed prison where the inmate guards their own cell. Because when belief is installed before reason, even questioning it feels like betrayal. The tragedy isn't just that people are trapped, it's that they think their captivity is devotion. They defend their chains as sacred. They call it freedom because they've never known anything else. And the cruelest part? They never realize the bars aren't around them. They're inside them, built from stories they were too young to question and too afraid to dismantle. The mirror of power. Religion claims to humble humanity before God, to remind us that we are small, that pride is a sin, that only the divine is worthy of worship. But look closer, and you'll see something very human hiding inside that humility. Because while religion lowers the masses before heaven, it quietly raises a select few above everyone else. Priests, prophets, popes, imams, people who speak on behalf of the infinite. They declare who's saved and who's damned, who deserves love and who deserves punishment. They hold the keys to eternity, not through knowledge or evidence, but through authority. And authority, once accepted as divine, stops being questioned. This structure doesn't mirror heaven, it mirrors politics. A pyramid of power wrapped in spiritual language, the faithful at the bottom, obedient and afraid. The interpreters in the middle, translating the will of God. And at the top, a human face claiming to represent the eternal. And history shows what happens next. Once spiritual authority becomes institutional, truth becomes negotiable. Churches build palaces, temples collect taxes, preachers build brands, kings rule by divine right. The line between sacred and self-interest disappears. Every empire learns to use religion as its reflection, a moral justification for control. Conquer in God's name, silence critics as heretics, rewrite morality to protect hierarchy. And when the system is threatened, it doesn't defend faith, it defends itself. Because when the messenger becomes more important than the message, spirituality dies, and politics takes its place. The robe becomes a uniform, the pulpit becomes a throne, and the word holy becomes the shield behind which power hides. Religion promised humility before the divine, but too often, it became the perfect disguise for human ambition, an empire built on the illusion of serving God. The cracks in the illusion. For the first time in history, the illusion is cracking. The same scriptures that once unified entire civilizations are now being read with open eyes, and the words don't look the same anymore. People are noticing the contradictions, the cruelty, the unmistakably human fingerprints smudged across what was once called divine. The stories that promised truth now reveal their flaws, creation myths that conflict with science, moral codes that justify slavery, laws written in the name of love but enforced with violence. The deeper people read, the more they see not a message from heaven, but a mirror of human fear, ignorance, and desire for control. They see miracles that never happen, prayers that go unanswered no matter how desperate, the same tragedies that strike believer and unbeliever alike. And slowly, doubt stops being a threat, it becomes a doorway. Technology made the illusion harder to maintain. The world is too connected, too informed. You can compare scriptures, question timelines, trace translations, and discover that holy texts evolved like any other story, edited, argued over, rewritten by people trying to make sense of the world. Once you see that, the spell starts to break. But here's the beautiful part. People aren't losing meaning. They're rediscovering it. They're realizing that awe, morality, and wonder were never dependent on ancient myths. That compassion doesn't need commandments. That purpose doesn't require promises of paradise. The illusion is breaking, not because people stopped believing in something greater, but because they realized greater doesn't mean supernatural. It means conscious, honest, free. Meaning was never locked inside temples or texts. It was always within us, waiting for the courage to stop confusing mythology with truth. The moment the fear fades, something strange happens when the fear of hell disappears. The world doesn't collapse, morality doesn't vanish. You don't become lost or wicked, you become free. Free in a way that's almost disorienting at first. For the first time, you can question without trembling. You can feel without guilt. You can act out of genuine empathy, not expectation. You stop asking, "What would God think?" and start asking, "What kind of person do I want to be?" It's in that shift, from obedience to awareness, that real morality begins. Because morality isn't divine, it's human. It's the quiet instinct that says kindness matters, even when no one is watching. It's the understanding that harm feels wrong, not because of punishment, but because of empathy. When the threat of eternal fire no longer hangs over you, something miraculous happens. Goodness becomes sincere. You help not for reward, but because you care. You tell the truth, not for heaven's approval, but for your own integrity. You start realizing that the entire moral architecture religion claimed to own was built from something far older and deeper, our shared humanity. Fear once kept us in line, but fear also kept us small. It made us mistake compliance for virtue. Once that fear fades, clarity takes its place. The world doesn't feel darker without divine judgment. It feels lighter. Responsibility shifts from the sky to our hands. And that's when freedom stops being frightening. You realize you don't need eternal consequences to live ethically. You just need consciousness, the awareness that this life, right here, is enough reason to live well. When fear fades, morality doesn't die. It finally becomes real, the human need beneath the myth. Religion wasn't evil by design. It was our first attempt to make sense of existence, a fragile mind's response to a terrifying world. When thunder roared, we imagined a god. When someone died, we imagined a soul. It was our first form of therapy, our first moral compass, our first comfort in the dark. We told stories not to deceive, but to survive. Myths were early science lessons, moral lessons, survival guides. They gave structure to chaos and meaning to suffering. Religion helped humans cooperate, grieve, and hope when everything around them felt unpredictable. It wasn't madness, it was genius, for its time. But what began as a bridge between fear and understanding eventually became a prison. The symbols hardened into laws, the stories fossilized into dogma. What once encouraged unity began enforcing conformity. Instead of guiding the mind forward, religion started binding it in place. The irony is, we no longer need mythology to feel what it once offered. Awe, love, purpose, these aren't gifts handed down from heaven, they're the natural language of consciousness itself. We feel them when we look at the night sky, hold someone we love, create something meaningful, or simply exist in awareness. The same wonder that ancient people projected onto God still lives inside us, only now, we can understand where it comes from. We can study it, nurture it, express it, without fear. The sacred was never somewhere else. It was always in the human capacity to care, to imagine, to seek truth. Religion tried to explain why we feel small beneath the stars. But maybe the real answer is simpler. We feel awe not because someone made the universe for us, but because we're finally learning to see it as it really is. The new story. Maybe it's time for a new story. One that doesn't divide the world into the saved and the damned, the chosen and the forgotten. A story that doesn't rely on threats of fire or promises of paradise to keep us moral, but trusts that goodness can exist without supervision. For thousands of years, we've been told that wonder is evidence of a creator, that the beauty of existence must point to something beyond it. But maybe the real miracle is that reality doesn't need to point anywhere. It's enough on its own. The stars don't need to be lanterns hung by divine hands to be breathtaking. A human life doesn't need to be eternal to have meaning. This new story wouldn't demand worship. It would invite understanding. It wouldn't ask for blind faith. It would celebrate honest curiosity. It would treat questions not as threats, but as the very essence of reverence. Because the more we learn, the more awe we feel, not less. It's a story without a single author, constantly written and rewritten by everyone who chooses awareness over obedience. It says we don't need an invisible ruler to tell us what's sacred, because the sacred is already here, in connection, in creation, in consciousness itself. And in this story, freedom replaces submission. Responsibility replaces fear. Compassion replaces commandment. We stop living for a world after this one, and start caring for the world we already have. Because truth doesn't need defending. It only needs to be seen clearly, without superstition, without distortion, without fear. And when we finally see it, the old stories don't feel threatening anymore. They simply become what they always were, our first drafts of understanding, written by hands that were still learning to see. Religion taught us to search for light, to look upward, to pray, to follow, to hope that meaning waited somewhere beyond us. But it forgot to tell us the truth. The light was never outside us. It was consciousness all along, the quiet ability to notice, to question, to understand. Every civilization needed its myths to survive, but survival is no longer enough. We don't live in darkness anymore. We live in information, in awareness, in connection. And awareness demands honesty, even when it's uncomfortable. Because once you stop seeing religion as sacred and start seeing it as a story written by frightened, curious humans trying to explain the unknown, you gain something far more powerful than belief: perspective. And that perspective changes everything. So if this made you pause, question, or feel that flicker of freedom, don't let it fade. Keep questioning, keep thinking. Because the moment you see through the story, you finally start living your own.